Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right, check-ins. Oof, I feel like this like a delicious thumos is flowing through my body. And if you don't know what the word thumos is, it's probably for the best right now. Welcome to the Stoa. My name is Peter Lindberg. I'm the steward of the Stoa. And the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today we have Doug Tataryn. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Doug Tataryn, who is the, I'm going to unmute you so you can correct me.
Tataryn.
Tataryn. Yeah, okay, Tataryn.
There's no R in the first TA. That we are from the Tartars, but we've given that part up. We're just Tataryns now.
Okay, cool. And then Doug is, he's the creator of something called the Bio-Emotive Framework. And a lot of people, a lot of my friends here in Toronto, in the sense-making community, they're just raving about this framework. And then Doug came to Toronto, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and I missed that one. And everyone was like, there's like the sob squad emerged from it. And I'm like, shit, I wish I was there. But I'm grateful that Doug has decided to visit the Stoa. And I'm pretty green at this, so I'm going to get an introduction. I'm sure a lot of you are going to get an introduction as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to record the first part. Doug is going to give like a talk, about 20-minute talk introducing the modality. And then we're going to do an exercise, and then I'll stop the record button when we go into the exercise. So that being said, I will hand it over to you, Doug. And you're on mute again. Let me see if I unmuted you.
So I welcome everybody. This is exciting for me. I'm always interested in exposing new people to this way of seeing the world. And what's particularly interesting is that I'm coming to a forum that has a particular way of seeing the world. And I'm kind of curious to see if there's any clashes or if this is a complementary kind of approach to being stoic and being, embracing stoicism. And partly because I kind of ad-lib these things. I know what the important points are, but it really helps me to know kind of who my audience is. So what I'd like, if you don't mind, before I start riffing in a particular direction, is if I can get like 3 or 4 people to give me like a 30-second to a minute kind of what brought you here and what are you hoping to get from this? If you can just give me some idea of what's going on inside your mind and your worlds, and I'll assume that 3 to 5 people is a representative sample. Not that it really is, but it'll give me something to kind of resonate with. So if we want to put up, do you guys know how to put up your hands? You can raise your hands if you open up the participants window. And if you do that, I should get a list of people popping up to the top. So if you don't mind sharing with me and the group what brings you here and what you're hoping to get from it, I'd appreciate it. So while people are considering that, and the other thing is we're going to record this first part. And then when it comes to the exercise where we might get into some experiential sharing, we're going to make sure that that's not available to the public. Okay, so you can share here. I imagine this isn't going to be too revealing in this first part. We're going to record my talk, and then when it comes to the exercise, we're going to either stop recording it or just reassure you that we will not be distributing it anywhere. Okay, does everyone agree with that? It's all good and confident. Great. See a lot of nodding heads. Thumbs up is good too. So Jonathan, if you don't mind sharing what you've heard and what you're hoping to get from this, that would be wonderful.
Hey, so I'm actually decently familiar with your work, mostly from friends who have been more directly involved, like Chao-Chu, who's somewhere on this call.
Chao-Chu, yeah. Sob Squad originator.
Sob Squad originator. And I've kind of done like prototypical attempts at doing this work on my own. And each time I go to something you hold, I seem to get like another piece of the puzzle for my own thing. So it's been valuable in that sense. and trying to move through some feelings right now and use all the help I can get, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jonathan. And Chow Chu and Malcolm were both, he goes by Malcolm Ocean. I don't even know if that's his real last name. But they were both instrumental in starting the Sob Squad. And I actually have some Sob Squad towels that I'm going to start sending out to people I do life coaching with, because I find that when we do this work, they just go through too many Kleenexes. And so towels kind of work when you're first doing the clearing stuff. Part of the assumption that we'll talk about is that crying is good for you and a missing piece of our health right now, but you got to do it properly, otherwise it's not that useful. So thank you, Jonathan. And Peter, can you make me a co-host so that I can lower their hands after they've spoken and I can just keep track? And I need more volunteers. I've only got one more after Jonathan. So if I can get, another volunteer or two, I would appreciate it. Thanks. So Andrew, if you can share.
Sure. I heard about you through the STOA, or more specifically through AJ, and he spoke very highly. And I feel like because of the, just being isolated, not isolated, but kind of like being in this, like, I guess physically isolated in the coronavirus, like there's a lot of tears that are happening. So I really want to and a lot of embracing of the feelings. So I want to really kind of just own it. Like I really want to kind of sharpen my my feeling toolbox.
Sweet. And I'll say that I don't mean to be from my experience, I've come to appreciate that there are productive and healthy ways of crying and processing your feelings, and there are unhealthy ways of crying and processing your feelings. And what I'm going to offer you is a method that seems to be healthy. I'm not willing to say this is the truth. I just know that this is a very useful heuristic. Okay. And I'll explain how I got the 9 core feelings after. They're actually research based, but it's still new. This is an emerging framework, but I have just really come to appreciate the potency of seeing the emotional world through this lens and how it can make such a difference in our both physical, our mental and our physical health and our social health. So, and my own practice, once Corona started, probably increased by 50%. And I'm sure it's because all the people who've been putting off, who knew about the work and been putting off, it's like, this isn't the right time. It's like, it was just in their face. It's like, I can't avoid this anymore. And I've had some really wonderful, people doing some very intense work and getting the benefits from it. So this is a wonderful opportunity to do the introspective work, and this is a really wonderful tool to do it with. So hopefully by the end of the session, you guys will also be agreeing with me. So thanks for sharing, Andrew. And
yeah, thank you.
Raven, if you could share.
Yeah, hi, Doug, thanks for being here. So how did I hear about this? I'm really naive to this process. I don't really know that much about it, but I have a friend who went to the monastic academy for their pre-apprenticeship program, and he specifically told me that the bio-emotive workshops for him were really catalyzing of emotional growth and change, and that he thought I specifically would be able to work through things using this method. I have a hearsay because he told me what he experienced, and now I have a fuzzy kind of recollection of what he said. But I think I'm really intellectual, and so I intellectualize my emotional states. And I feel like in some ways I've just reached an end point of being able to actually process what's going on and in an interior way. And so I think I'm interested in new ways of accessing my inner world. And it seems like this method has that potential to it. So that's why I'm here today.
Sweet. Well, I'm glad to be able to introduce it to you firsthand like this in person. I'm looking forward to people's reactions. So, Has anybody not been exposed to somebody who's done this work? And could you tell me what drew you in? Just anyone else willing to chat? Otherwise, I'll give up if no one says yes in a second. Victoria, wonderful.
Hello, Doug. I don't have my video on right now, but I'm a friend. I live in Vancouver, so I'm joining you from the West Coast. And a friend of mine, Michelle Lechnick, she's a Winnipeg person, and you know that the smile says it all. She's a really good friend of mine, and we have lots of very existential conversations all the time. And we had one this week, and she just threw this at me out of the blue and was like, "You need to do this. This is the right thing for you." So so I did a little bit of research. She sent me some links, and the group that she's part of with Alexandra, I think, or Ali. So I have absolutely no idea what I'm getting into. I don't know anything about this at all, but I trust Michelle implicitly and her sort of guidance on it. And it felt like a bit of a serendipitous calling or whatever. So I'm here as a complete novice as well, like Raven said too, just to kind of see what this is all about. And it felt like a right time. There's obviously, with everything that we've been experiencing personally and collectively, it does feel like the time for this kind of work. So yeah, I'm here with perfect faith, really. Just see what happens.
All right. Well, it's probably good to have faith in Michelle. She's a wonderful person. She's
totally
an incredible being, and becoming quite a glowing being as well.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to stop it here. I appreciate Jane putting up her hand, but I know we've got a lot to cover, and so I'm going to start talking. And one of the first things that and I don't know, Peter. Yeah, you're letting people in because I've let some people in too. There's a concept that I want to introduce you to. Most of you haven't heard of this word, and if you have, it's usually in an individual context. But when I first started getting into clinical work, I'd done work in an area called alexithymia. And alexithymics were something that you could actually, and interesting, the concept came out of Toronto by a researcher. I think his name was Taylor. And he measured people's ability to process their emotions. And he had a scale. And on that scale, if you took it, about 15% of people would be considered alexithymic. So it was a Toronto alexithymia scale, the TAS. And I used that for quite a number of years. But as a researcher, when I actually went into clinical work and I was working with people trying to get them to do, I was using a Gendlin's focusing technique, but I was really helping people get to the tears. It was really clear that when I asked the question to people, what are you feeling? They couldn't answer it. They were giving me stories about it. They'd state, well, I feel, and then they'd give me a story, and they'd give me behavioral analogs or metaphors, but almost nobody talked about their feelings. And so I come up with this construct of cultural alexithymia. And it basically means there's a problem somewhere in either experiencing or expressing or resolving your emotional state. Okay? So alexithymia, where we as a researcher would think 10 to 15% of the population has alexithymia or some trouble with, processing their emotions. My experience as a clinician was it was more like 85, 90, 95% of people were deficit in that area. And there's an interesting thing that for more theoretical context, I use the concept of the triune brain as a good metaphor for the kind of different ways of approaching the world. So Paul MacLean was a brilliant researcher that in the 70s came up with this triune brain concept, and more researchers are embracing it. We know that the brain is modular. Exactly what the modules are, everybody argues about, but the bigger picture is that we've got a physical brain, an emotional brain, and an intellectual brain. Now, they're all highly interconnected, but in terms of modules, we seem to have these three independent networks that are looking at the world through a different lens. And so he called them the reptilian, the mammalian, and the neo-mammalian, and some other, words. But basically, it comes down to, and this was based on like 30 years of research, right? And neuroanatomical maps and studying animals for like, and their brain structures. But it comes down to, we have a physical brain that looks after our body. And then on top of that, which is the reptilian brain, so it regulates heart rate and digestion and basic survival stuff. We've got a limbic brain, or an emotional brain, that looks after what I refer to as our relational dynamics. Okay, and that's where mammals come in. That fight, flight, dominance hierarchy starts to organize animals into groups, so that a pack of wolves can bring down a caribou that an individual animal can't. And it's the hierarchy that comes from the anger fight component and the submission that organizes that activity. And then once you've got the groups, there's bonding and everything. So you get both the social and survival and social emotions there. And that basically is a rudimentary form of communication. It allows groups to form and communicate and work together. And that's mammals, pretty much all mammals. That's why we can bond with dogs, because they have that emotional brain. And it's hard to bond in the same way with a reptile. And if you feel really bonded to a reptile, that's wonderful, but I'm not sure the reptile feels bonded to you because they don't have the structures that allow that kind of processing to take place. There may be some exceptions, but in general, mammals have a very specific bonding and group relational kind of status that they're always processing. And then the intellectual brain, which is characteristics of primates, formed and allowed us to think about the world. The other ones are just very much being in the world. And this trichotomy actually kind of gets rediscovered and formed into different ways of seeing the world every 10 or 15 or 100 years. So when I went to school, we informally talked about the nerds, the academics, the jocks, and the artsy types. And that corresponds to the physical brain dominant ones, the emotionally dominant ones, and the intellectually dominant ones, even though I didn't say it in that order. And we see that in Buddhism, we've got body, speech, and mind, which corresponds to the physical. The speech, when it's done right, is an emotional, expressive kind of process, and the mind is the intellect. And we see these ways of seeing the world. I've got a blog where I talk about another 5 or 10 different ways of how this triune structure of our human condition shows up in our world in different ways. And our culture is extremely biased towards nurturing the physical. So we got strong athletes and surgeons, right? And we nurture the intellect with all of our years of academic training. But the emotional system gets very little explicit training. If, the best we do is we encourage the arts, and dance and expression nowadays. And, modern dance is very expressive, but we don't really understand the emotional system to the level that we understand the other two systems. Now, I make an explanation because I was very confused by why, if we've evolved through the physical, emotional, and intellectual brains, and we're all into this intellect, why don't we have a better understanding of the emotional brain if this is something we've already evolved through? And this is where I really was excited to come up with, well, I've spent a lot of time in Integral. My wife, Darlene, who is on this call, I saw her smiling and I just see her picture there. We taught integral theory. We got involved with it in the 90s, and we taught integral theory to a group in Selkirk for about 8 or 9 years. And part of integral theory is this embrace of evolutionary development, that human beings go through stages of development. And what in a theory that I put together that's a slight variation of AQUIL integral, I call it EBIC, or Evolving Brains in Quadrants. And I presented this in 2010 at a conference for integral theory. The basic tenet is that our developmental stages kind of go through the physical brain, the emotional brain, and the intellectual brain. And that the traditional, or the, how many people are familiar with in integral and spiral dynamics? If you can just raise your hands. Yeah, most people are, a lot of people are, which is wonderful. So the basic gist is that we know that the blue stage of development, which I refer to as traditional, really, it's about rules and roles. And so I grew up in the 50s, 60s, and I caught the end of the 50s, which was very traditional in terms of how our households were structured and how we treated women and children. And, you know, I would hear things like, kids should be seen and not heard. You know, the man is the king of his, man's home is his castle. Women should be barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. And we're kind of appalled at some of these things now. We don't follow these, but these aphorisms were ways of training people into their roles, right? Like as a kid, you were just told kids should be seen and not heard. So I'm being told what my role is. Women are told what their role is. And that structure of development works because everyone plays their role. But if you start introducing emotions to that, like, do you get to be depressed and make the meals for your husband? You can't, because if you don't make your meals, husband doesn't eat, husband doesn't go out to the farm and work, you know, or on the field or whatever he's doing, everything falls apart. If the man gets depressed and can't work, can't fulfill his role, it falls apart. So for the most part, emotions were extremely suppressed. And how many people are here old enough to have heard the phrase, you want something to cry? You know, you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. Put up your hand. Like, and what's amazing is, like, how many of you aren't from North America? I've had people in Sweden put up their hand, in Europe put up their hand. I go, how the hell does a meme like that spread around the entire world without anybody being conscious of it? But it's there across all the cultures. You're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. And I was literally spanked until I stopped crying. That's when I would stop getting spanked. I was literally taught I had to suppress my emotions to survive. So that was traditional. We then moved into orange, modern individuality, and emotions just get in the way of your achievement. They interfere with your ability to function, so you suppress them. Plus, you know, you're in an individual mode, so emotions don't really have a role. It's not till we get to postmodernism that suddenly we care about having a deep relationship with people. So how many people here are looking for or in a relationship where they want a deep, soulful connection with their partner? Now, almost everybody's putting up their hand. If you would have asked that question in the 50s and 60s, people would have said, what the hell are you talking about? That's not what it's about. It's like, that man makes enough money, he's got good teeth and a healthy body, you know, he'll be a good person to have offspring with. And that's why arranged marriages work in that level of development, because you're looking for a role. The individual doesn't matter. So we've moved into a postmodern context where we want to be individuals, and we want to know the other individual. And what's the best question to ask somebody if you want to know about their soul, if you want to know about the depths of who they are. Well, how do you feel about that? Right? What's going on with the all the protests in North America? You want to really get to know someone, you say, how do you feel about the protests? Whereas in traditional, it would be, you know, those people out there, they shouldn't be doing that. That's wrong. They're disrupting society, right? There's just really one or two answers, and it's pretty black and white. But here, if I asked each individual here, how do you feel about the protests? I would get very different answers. And it would be an opportunity for me to get to know you deeply, especially if I shared, wow, like that's very different than how I feel. It almost is disruptive to hear you say that. And I'm curious as to how you got there. That's a very postmodern perspective. And how many people have done circling? And do you recognize the kind of tone that I portrayed in that curiosity, non-judgmental curiosity? That's about the depth of connection without judging the other person's perspectives, because you want to try on that world. As a clinician, I've learned that no matter how, quote, crazy somebody appears in their actions, if I can look out their eyes, their world starts to make sense. If I can ask the right questions on how you see this and what you're feeling, suddenly their configuration forms. And it's like, wow, now I understand why you wanted to X or Y or why you did that. It seemed crazy at first, but I can see how it makes sense to you. So it's that deep feeling exchange that we're now all primed for, but don't have the tools for. Because if I ask you how you feel about X or Y, I can almost guarantee most of you, you will not give me feelings. You'll give me stories or metaphors or beliefs. And some of you who give feelings, that's awesome. You're not alexithymic, you know, but the just kind of note that when you ask people what they're feeling, see if they actually give you feelings. I was listening in on an expressive therapy call the other day, and someone said, how do you feel about that? And nobody actually gave a feeling. They all just started talking. It's like, I feel that these people really don't understand what's going on. It's like, well, that's not a feeling, right? And you might not even recognize that that's not a feeling, but we'll get to that after. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. I've covered a lot of ground, and I'll take some questions, and then we'll move on to the next little phase. So does anyone have any questions that they want to clarify? Just pop your hand up, and then we'll clarify that, okay? I've covered a lot of ground, and I just want to, and if you don't have a question, then at least maybe give me some feedback as to whether this is making sense, or if there's any insights, or if this is helping you in any way. Anjan, if you can speak.
Thanks, Doug. If I was understanding you correctly, there's a historical arc to us suppressing emotions. And you seem to have suggested that the lifestyle and livelihood of a farmer particularly causes emotion suppression. Did I understand that correctly? And could you explain why the farming lifestyle particularly encourages that more than what came later?
And I'll say it's not the farming lifestyle. So I'm glad you're asking for clarification. And this is actually the joy of postmodernism, is that people will ask questions for clarification, and you have an opportunity, because people that live in such different worlds, right? Like in my world, what I said was just, it made sense. Now you're hearing it differently. And so I get a chance to, you know, explain the nuances. So in North America, Canada, in the 1950s and earlier, probably 80–90% of families, even in cities, were one generation removed from the farm. That most people had if you said, I'm going to the farm for the weekend, people knew what you meant. because they had a grandpa or a granny still living on the farm. And there was an era where that was confounded with the developmental 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s of traditional consciousness. And so you can be on a farm now, on a commune, and you got a postmodern embrace of farming. But back then they were very merged, that the farming kind of mentality, the pioneer mentality, was very traditional. When we landed in North America, it was a very traditional consciousness. It's still part of colonialism. And so for me, those two are synonymous, but it's no longer true anymore. Is that making sense to you?
Maybe then I would follow up, like, could you elaborate on why emotional suppression is like adaptive and helpful under those circumstances?
Because in traditional consciousness, your obligation is to fulfill your role. If you're a husband or a worker, you just have to do what you're expected to do, and emotions get in the way of that.
Mm.
And emotions are too individualizing, right? They start making you unique. And so, like, when the hippies came into being and they grew hair long, that was a radical symbol of protest against the conformity of the roles that they were expected to step into, right? So that was their rebellion against conforming to the roles. I literally watched my father yell at my mother for saying she wanted to get a driver's license. Why do you need to leave the house? What are you going to do? I can take you shopping. You know, and I remember the crying and the arguments about it, and that was in the 70s. And then, you know, she eventually got one and it was okay, but her stepping out of her role was very threatening to him.
Thanks, that helps a lot.
Sweet. Anyone else besides Anjan? Everything is crystal clear what I'm saying? Anybody want to share that what I've said has been helpful? But James has just raised his hand. So if James, you want to chat, that would be great.
Thanks, Doug. I think I just have I mean, maybe I happened to space out at the moment that you mentioned it.
Can you speak up a little bit, James?
Yeah. Can you hear me better now?
A little bit better, but still not that loud. How's everyone else hearing them? Yeah, it's not too good. It's very low.
You know what? I will save my question for another time. It's going to take too long to figure this out.
Well, I just heard you fairly well now.
Okay, here I go. So the question is about, like, as you're talking about these different sort of states or levels of consciousness, moving from traditional into modern sort of role-based thinking, into something more around emotions and individuality, I reflect in myself that I can see how I am predominantly in one state of being, but these other states of being still do express themselves in different ways. So I think I want to get maybe a clarification on whether or not you're talking about a progression that's like, once you're up, or that we, you know, at any given point are always a moving expression of all the states that have come before us as well.
That's like the #1 question plaguing developmental theory, and whether it's a hierarchical development, and people are making all sorts of models up to try and explain how it is we can apparently move or digress to lower stages of development, and how does that make sense. And what I've come to see, so people have talked about like a center of gravity where you're kind of in one stage but you've got pieces below you and pieces above you, and that kind of works. I've actually started to believe that it's not so much hierarchical as contextual, that a child being born into a postmodern stage of development is having huge demands made on them on how to see the world, and that they will start embodying a postmodern rhetoric and persona, even if they haven't individuated fully. And so there's, you know, it's very contextual when they can have that sensitivity to others, but when it comes to knowing who they are, and what they're doing with their life, they have no idea. And one of the things about doing it in a hierarchy is that there is better preparation. Like one of the insights I've had about modernism is that it's not just achievement oriented, it's extremely humbling. You know, anyone who's individuated or got to explore who they are and what they can do in the world, how many of you have achieved all of the potential that you felt you had? Put up your hands if you've achieved all of the potential of your individuation. It's extremely humbling. It's not, you know, it's like we're not all world-class athletes. We're not all the greatest musicians. We're not all going to become millionaires. And so that humbling process of modernity really sets the stage for a true understanding of postmodernism, where you get that everybody is sort of suffering and everybody's doing the best they can. And that's a true embrace of other people's worlds. You've been humbled enough to not believe you know what's going on. And for people who haven't gone through that, I think that's part of why we get the social justice warriors, because they're more at a traditional rules, roles, black and white thinking kind of thing. And they go with that more essential component into the postmodern rhetoric, but they still parse it at this lower stage. So, you know, it really is, I think they're like different ways of handling different situations, right? If you get drawn into a conflict with somebody, you're likely either going to go traditional rules and roles, this is how you should act, or you're going to get angry and try and intimidate them into, you know, being a certain way. And then when you're not in conflict, you can kind of be in an intellectual position. So we kind of move up and down the developmental stages depending on the development. And some of us are, well, it gets a little bit too complicated, but it's very much more contextual than developmental, but we kind of have to do all the stages anyway, because they all have their place in different situations. Postmodern embrace of everything in the midst of really gross violence doesn't do that well. Sometimes you have to, you know, address somebody trying to shoot you with survival instincts, not speech, right? So that's a different sort of story, and maybe triggering people, and I wish we could get into it, but not. So let's go back to processing emotions. So one of the things that I have come to appreciate is most of us don't achieve what we hope to achieve because we've got something interfering with our actualizing ourselves. So how many people here find themselves knowing they should do something, but they, for some reason, don't do that? Okay, now, thank you for being honest, and thank you for putting up your hands. The question is, what do you do about that? Now, most people will try and rationally override and convince themselves and use willpower. What I've found is that most of us have an emotional impression in our system that we've been carrying around for a while, which gets stimulated into existence at the exact wrong times and interferes with us taking that step. So let's suppose I'm an entrepreneur and I have this great product and I've done all of this work, and I've done, you know, I can sit at home on the computer, do all of this stuff. And now it comes to the point where I have to start phoning people and selling them on the idea. But I find I never quite get around to that phone call. I can go see all the coaches and get all the advice on how to do it, how to set it up, and how to do so many cold calls a day. But what I find is that that person's being triggered by the phone call, and they've got an unconscious emotional fear, you know, of what's going to happen. So let's suppose a person has a deep feeling of insignificance. they find that every time they go to make a phone call, they start thinking, oh, that person doesn't want to talk to me. I'm going to interrupt that person. They're too important to want to talk to me, right? Or maybe they got a feeling of helplessness. And it's like, oh, it doesn't no matter what I do, I'm never going to get people to like, you know, go with this product. And it's an unconscious thing. They're not saying this out loud. They're feeling it, and they collapse away from their goals. And I'm using entrepreneurship because I've worked with entrepreneurs. And it's amazing when you do this work, how suddenly you can move through those barriers. And I think in many ways, entrepreneurship is an awesome spiritual practice, because it forces you to face all of your unresolved issues, because there's so many steps involved in becoming a successful entrepreneur that everybody's issues will be triggered at some point. Just like a good relationship will trigger everybody's unresolved issues at some point. That's why relationships are so difficult. They sensitize us. So now I've been talking about impressions. I'm going to give you a phrase, and this is what I would consider like a pith teaching. A pith teaching means that it's like the sutras are pith teachings. The more you understand about the teachings and you go back and read the same sutras, the more you'll get from those sutras or those teachings. So here's a pith teaching from the Bio-Emotive Framework. And it's funny, I've gone to that window twice and it didn't come. So any intense interpersonal encounter that's not fully experienced and expressed will become part of your sense of self or worldview instead of something that happened to you. Now, take a few seconds to contemplate that. Any intense interpersonal encounter that isn't fully experienced and expressed will become part of your sense of self or worldview instead of something that happened to you. So for example, I worked with somebody who had OCD. This is an extreme. It doesn't have to show up as OCD. And she was working in an institution where perfectionism was reinforced, doing things properly and rigorously. And so her OCD was helpful, but then it started getting in the way. So she comes for therapy. And we're going through her history, trying to find the feelings that were going on between her, you know, underneath her need for perfection. And we came across a memory where she was in kindergarten and she had this half hour to draw a picture. And she really loved her kindergarten teacher. So she drew a picture of the kindergarten teacher and her together and just put her whole heart into it. And then at the end of the half hour, you know, art period, she went up to the teacher and just like meekly gave it to the teacher, like with her whole heart, like trying to express this deep sense of connection. And the teacher looked at it and she was busy. She says, you can do better than that, and gave it back to her. And it just devastated her. You can do better than that. Meanwhile, she'd put her entire heart into making this beautiful picture. And the impression was of inadequacy. She felt inadequate. And she didn't go home and cry about it, where her parents could hold her and have her talk about the experience and let her know that it was a beautiful picture and maybe say that the teacher was just busy, but where she'd feel loved and accepted for where she was. She didn't do that. She didn't fully experience and express it. So it became part of her sense of self and worldview. So that generalized into my trying my best is not enough. I am inadequate, and even my best isn't good enough. So if your best isn't good enough, you do 110%, 120%. You do it beyond your best. She became perfectionistic. Once she found that and cried about it and talked about how devastating it was as a child to do that, guess what happened? She lost a whole lot of the energy that was driving her perfectionism. And it took one or two other examples of those kinds of things, because we tend to relive the same experiences once we've got an impression in. But eventually she essentially lost her OCD-ness. And that's an example. Now it's become an event that happened to her. Okay, now there's a book called Unlocking the Emotional Brain that's also discovered the same process from a very, very different perspective. I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and it's nice to have convergence and validity in some research saying that this is what people are doing to rewire the emotional system. So impressions, somebody asked me in group the other day who'd done a lot of meditation, when I think about clearing my emotional system, it feels like a lifetime of work that I can't believe it could ever just be cleared. And the nice thing about this work is that what I found with my 9 core feelings is that there are just 9 of them. Literally over 3 years of clinical practice and me doing a Gendlin's focusing process and asking, bringing people to tears over and over and asking, what's the core of your feeling? What's the word that vibrates with the deepest level of pain in you? And they'd say this word after 5, 6, 10 different words. This is the word that deeply resonates. I wrote the word down. And 100 clients later, or 200, whatever it was over the 3 years, I had 9 words. Just astounding. 9 words at the core of all of our pain and suffering. And that's why I believe that this is like the perceptual apparatus of our emotional brain for perceiving our relational status. And so as a child, you've probably taken in core impressions that have affected how you feel about yourself and your relationship to the world. So we're going to do an exercise now that I call the Core Feelings Psychograph. And what this is an opportunity to just tune into your world. I'm going to have you say a phrase out loud, and then you're going to rank how much reverberation in your body you get from it on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 means you're almost in tears, or you're crying, or you would be crying if it was a better social situation to do that in. 0 means no resonance at all. So this is a psychograph. If the more open and vulnerable you can be, okay, the more kind of signal there will be to noise. We've got all sorts of repressive mechanisms that keep us from feeling things. So even if you've got that, you can get a sense, even if they only go to 4 or 5, you'll see the relative weighting. And that'll give you an idea of where your issues are and how you might be distorting the world. Anyone have any questions about what we're going to do before we do it? Or any clarification, probably better for what I've talked about. So the way I parse the world, interpersonal feelings like rejected, abused, dismissed, create core feelings. People react very differently to being rejected. Some people feel worthless, some people feel insignificant, some people feel helpless, etc. Then causes the emotion. So it's a very simple linear system. Feelings cause emotions. Interpersonal feelings express the dynamics between 2 people. Core feelings are about how I feel about myself and my relational status to the world, cause emotions. This psychograph is going to get a sense of what's embedded in your system. You can do this paper also in a situation. If you've had a fight with your spouse or something happened at work or with a good friend, write the situation down, go through the situation, find the feelings. And ideally, it'll bring you to tears. And once you've done that enough, you'll find a pattern. Okay, so we're going to open up, here's the link, it's in the chat room. If you press on tinyurl.com/BEFcore, it's going to open up a Google document. Now this document, it'll ask for your email address. That gets put in my database, so you're going to be registered on my website. If you don't want that, you can unsubscribe. But this is a way of sending you the summary PDF afterwards. I wrote the code in here in Java or in Google Script to take all your information and create a PDF and send it to you so that you can look at your psychograph and keep a record. You can do this over time. Now, doing it on the computer is a little distance. It's easy to be intellectual. So even if you don't get the emotional crying, you'll get the insights. You'll see kind of what your wiring is. So is everyone opening it up and it's working okay? Okay. So I'm going to open that up as well. And I'm going to do something a little differently this time, which is, so you can put your email in alias. You can skip out to what you're upset about. And when you say, briefly describe the situation causing your distress, just say, this is a psychograph of my life. Okay, so you know it's not situational. And then just check out how you're feeling right now, just as an emotional being, and see how much sort of emotional energy there is. You know, I don't have it set up for positive or negative, but if you've got any negative emotional energy, just that you kind of live with on a day-to-day basis, just rate how big it feels in this context. Okay? Now, I am then going to say, have you repeat the words. So please don't go ahead, okay, of yourself or of me, because I want to specifically give you a certain type of experience, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently than the form. So the first thing I want you to do is close your eyes, take a few breaths, and I want you to say out loud with a kind of curiosity, I feel alone. I feel alone. And depending on the state of your emotional system, you'll get some resonance. You can try variations like, I'm all alone in the world. I'm all alone. I feel alone. And just get a sense. If that phrase makes you want to cry, then put a 10. If there's just moderate activation, put a 5. Now, staying in that space, so open your eyes enough to answer, you know, to respond to the question, but also I'm going to read a definition out to you, and I want you to see if that changes the amount of kind of activation. Sometimes our emotional systems don't recognize the words, but they can kind of relate more to the scenario. So hanging out with I feel alone, alone, having no sense of connection or commonality with anyone around you. One can be in close physical proximity to people, even engaging in small talk at a crowded party or social gathering, and still feel very alone in the world. Lonesome, solitary, and isolation are close cousins in the interpersonal world. Watching all the people huddled together in apparently deep, meaningful conversation, laughing and engaged with each other, made me feel very alone in the world as I shuffled from one group to another, looking for some sense of connection. So just see how your emotional system resonated with that definition and that example. And if you got more resonance once you kind of started relating to those words, then just increase your score. Now we're going to move on to the next one. I want you to say, I feel inadequate. I feel inadequate. Sometimes the words I am inadequate might resonate more, so try that. I am inadequate. And give yourself a number between 0 and 10 for how much that resonates. Lacking in capacity or skill to achieve the goal or overcome the challenge or obtain the outcome you desire. It's something you might have the potential to achieve if you work at it, but you're not presently capable. Feeling deficient, insufficient, or lacking are its cousins in the interpersonal world. I felt inadequate as I wrestled with the heavy box and it thumped on the floor, not having been able to lift it high enough to place it on the counter. I felt inadequate as I tried to express my feelings to my partner and it just kept going wrong and I couldn't do any better. And just if you got an increase from that, then mark it up a little bit higher. We're going to go on to the next one. I feel insignificant. I feel insignificant. I am insignificant. Now, if you're crying, I hope it's okay. This is kind of an exploration as to what's going on with your emotional system. If it's overwhelming, then I would encourage you after this to reach out for support and talk to somebody. Don't handle this on your own if you can, if you have options. And if you are overwhelmed and don't have anyone to reach out to, then maybe send an email to me, and I can turn you towards some support. But hopefully there is support for you somewhere. The other thing, if you find yourself getting tired or yawning, or bored and wanting to leave, that might tell you something about your relationship to your emotions. Some people, when their emotional system gets activated, they close down, they shut down, they get tired. It's a kind of stress-induced narcolepsy. And I've actually had people fall asleep during therapy as I got their emotional systems activated because it's just an automatic kind of shutdown. So I feel insignificant. To feel small and unimportant, like you don't register in another person's world. Lacking position or influence on matters important to you. Its close cousins are small, invisible, unimportant, and overlooked. I felt small and insignificant as my boss congratulated a colleague who got the position I had applied for. He hadn't even bothered talking to me first before making the announcement. So we're going to pause there. We've done 3 of the 9. And I'd like you to just reflect, if you don't mind, on how this is going for you, what's happening, if you don't mind sharing. any experiences, insights, or feelings? Can people put up their hand or even just, unmute themselves in chat? Does anyone want to share? Ideally, someone who hasn't spoken yet, but
Doug, just a few administrative questions. Should we stop recording right now?
I guess I'm okay with recording I guess we don't need the recording. Yeah, so I guess the only thing is could you pause it when we do this part? And
start it up, yeah.
We'll start it when I talk?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. I feel lost. I feel lost. That means you don't have a vision. I feel lost. Unable to find your way, not knowing which direction to go to obtain one's goal. While it's easy to relate to feeling lost in terms of the physical location, it's most often experienced in modern times as being without a vision, or having a vision and no idea how to achieve it, or having no idea how to make sense of what's going on. John felt quite lost after receiving notice he was not accepted into the military academy. He'd organized his whole life around becoming a fighter pilot and had no idea what to do with himself now. So mark in the kind of resonance you have there. We're going to go on to I feel helpless. I feel helpless. I feel helpless. Mark what you've got there. Helpless, the inability to affect change in the area you want, like feeling trapped in a job you hate but can't afford to quit. Having someone hold you down and you can't move no matter how hard you try. The words powerless, weak, and impotent are close cousins in the interpersonal world. Jennifer remembers feeling very helpless as a 4-year-old, listening to her mother and father fight, yelling and screaming at each other. All she wanted was for them to stop, but no amount of yelling, screaming, or crying on her part seemed to make any difference. I feel helpless. Moving on to worthless. I feel worthless. I feel worthless. This can be very threatening for people. If you're giving yourself a 0 without even thinking about it, just maybe be open to wondering if maybe that's in there and you're hiding from it. It's not necessarily always true, but it often does happen. Feeling like you have no worth, no value to anyone or anything. Feeling like you bring nothing beneficial to the world or the people around you. Some people relate more to the interpersonal feeling of being broken at a fundamental level, like they were born with a deficit that makes them very different from other human beings. I feel worthless. John was getting so much negative feedback about his fixation with his smartphone that he was beginning to think there was something wrong with him. He realized he was starting to feel like a worthless human being who would never amount to anything. I feel worthless. I feel an emptiness. I feel an emptiness inside. Now, when you're doing it situationally, you say, I feel a loss. Now, when you've had a loss for a long time, a feeling of loss that doesn't resolve itself over time will become a feeling of emptiness, a hole in your heart where the positive feeling once lived. So living with a loss for a long time ends up becoming a feeling of emptiness. Going to move on. I feel like a bad person. I feel like a bad person. A person feels bad when they've violated one or more rules or norms associated with the vision of their group, family, or tribe, or one that they've come to hold as their own. While experiencing any negative feeling state could be described as feeling bad, this feeling is always feeling bad something, like I'm a bad person, a bad daughter, a bad son, a bad wife. Being ostracized and shunned are interpersonal cousins of this feeling and are very important to maintaining adherence to the collective values of the group. Jeremy felt bad that his preoccupation with the girl in the stand caused him to miss the pass and allow the other team to score. Samantha felt really bad about herself that she screamed at her children, that she spent her whole life wanting to be a better mother than hers had been. The last core feeling is hopeless. I feel hopeless. So say that out loud. Remember, it's important to say the words out loud. I feel hopeless. I feel hopeless. The feeling of hopelessness arises when you feel the negative state you're in is never going to change. Victoria felt hopeless about her exams. She'd been studying for weeks, and every time she took a practice test, her grades did not improve. George felt hopeless. No matter how many times he called his girlfriend to apologize, all he received were harsh words and rejection. He cried as he accepted his aloneness and realized he would never feel her warm embrace again. It was hopeless. I'm just catching the comment on the chat about the tone of my voice, and yes, I am intentionally using tone to induce states. That's kind of what we're here for. And if my tone can trigger you, awesome. It means you probably have something going on. Yeah, this isn't, the thing about the emotional system is that it's not rational. Okay, it came before the intellect. It evolved before the intellect. It's an irrational process by definition, but it's lawful. You know, we're discovering the laws of the emotional system so that we can work with it. And tone and interpersonal context make a big difference than just approaching it from an intellectual point of view. So we've had quite a journey here. I hope you complete the form and hit return. You'll get put on the mailing list. You'll get the PDF. And let's just take a few minutes to share. What was this experience like for you? And let's just kind of do popcorn. You don't have to put your hands up, okay? Just what was this like? You've been coming to these Stoic sessions for a while. You've got different frameworks. I noticed I listened to Benita Roy's frame on emotions, and it's really interesting. Her 3x3 grid of emotions. This is very different. This has a very different approach to emotions, and it differentiates feelings where she was differentiating affects and things. So what's your take on this from both an emotional and an intellectual point of view? How is this landing, guys? Give me some feedback. And girls, I hope you know I'm using the word generically, genderlessly. Maybe Gray can chat. Do you mind if I call on you?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Sorry, feedback there. Yeah, I noticed that the three feelings that I rated the highest were the feeling lost and feeling alone and feeling an emptiness. And it was interesting, like, writing those in that question at the bottom where you like say which ones you rated highest made me realize, oh, that's all of the things that I feel challenged at the Stoa on. Like I feel alone, but then here I'm reaching out to people even when that kind of feels triggering, and I like have to confront my issues with distrust and stuff like that, and I feel really alone, and then I come here and people express things to me that make me feel so much belonging, and I'm like, wow, that's really new. I don't know how to even really interpret that sometimes. And then yeah, I feel really lost and I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm like really uncertain about my life path, and then everybody here feels like very like-minded and gives me really powerful ideas that resonate with me, and I don't know how they're going to like fit together into a picture of my future, but I get such a like strong like positive like hunch that I'm like on the right track by being here. So it was kind of interesting to me that it just so clarified for me that I'm like actually kind of responsive to these core feelings that are alive in me.
Beautiful. And you're actually bringing us to another level, which is you have the opportunity to take in positive feelings of connection and caring. Every one of these negative core feelings has a corresponding positive one that we're often exposed to, but we don't take in the impression because our emotional system shut down. And by finding the feelings and feeling beliefs, we can open them up and take in the impressions, and it'll upgrade the system, right? But you have to feel the negative feelings for it to meet reality and realize that it's not 3 or 5 years or 10 years old anymore, and it's living in a new world. Anyway, thank you so much for braving your loneliness and your insecurities, and embracing the group and letting us kind of love you collectively. Appreciate your contributions. Anyone else like to share? Just turn your mic on and say something. Andrew?
Oh, I'm very aware of how exhausted I am. Like I'm very and just enough exhaustion to just even talk to you right now. But I feel that like just like I want to go and take a nap. Like I'm done.
Yes. So there's two things going on. One is, because we've closed our emotional systems down, when we get the energy moving, it's meeting a lot of friction. So if you get activated to an 8, but you only express a 2, you've got 6 units of tension in your system. That's one reason you get exhausted from doing this work. And the other is, if we've done this long enough, we've learned to close down, to shut down. This is like how depression works. You get activated, you don't process it. It's too dangerous to stay activated because it's not going anywhere. So you literally shut down and go to sleep until the activation passes. But then you get up again and you get stimulated and you don't express it, and your system has a shutoff valve, right? So you have to learn to unlearn that process and make it okay to have feelings and emotions. But it makes sense that you've been doing this because you haven't been given the tools for the aliveness that you do have. You didn't shut your emotional systems down well enough like we did in the 60s, and so, now this is what I feel, this or something like this is necessary to complete the postmodern move. If you don't articulate your feelings and emotions at this level, you'll never really understand and embrace feelings at the level you need to have the depth of communication and relationship you're looking for with yourself and others. It's 4:31. I'll take one more comment if someone wants to share something, and if not, yeah, Nathan.
So I found out about your framework from listening to the Emerge podcast, and this was quite recently. But I didn't have the list of the 9 core feelings, so it was very interesting for me going through this exercise with you. And I actually found, to back up one more, I played around with this with myself, seeing what kind of core feelings I found. And I had named some feelings, and I actually found them here on this list that you shared.
Awesome.
One other thing, I really felt a strong emotional reaction to quite a lot of them. And I'm like, I think like 6 or 7 of them, I'm up around 9 or 10. I'm like, and I'm curious if but almost some of them kind of seem to live in the same place, like, worthless, hopeless, and a bad person. That all kind of drew me to like a core feeling. That's not to co-opt your language, but
yeah. And I had that experience when I was finding these core feelings. I had a hard time differentiating some of them. Like hopeless and helpless felt the same to me, and eventually I realized hopeless was a temporal component of being stuck in a feeling, and helpless was its own unique feeling. That I could feel hopeless about my insignificance or hopeless about my worthlessness, but originally hopeless and helpless felt the same. The other thing is, developmentally, we're programmed to fuse some of them. So if I'm feeling inadequate at a modern level, I'll also feel worthless, because my value at modern is based on what I can do. So if I can't do much, then I am worthless. It's not to postmodern that you get intrinsic worth and value for just being you. So you can see how different developmental levels don't have these distinctions. They literally are, if you are inadequate or helpless, you are worthless. And so we have to like work to extract those out in this new modern, postmodern world. So I'm actually supposed to be golfing in an hour and a bit, and I've got an hour and a bit of a drive. So this has been wonderful. I hope that you continue checking out this work, and I hope this has helped you on your journeys. And if you want to give me feedback, you can always send me something at info@bioemotiveframework.com. I'd love to hear from you. And check out our website. We've got a variety of programs and online sessions. that you can join and resources that we're putting together. And, you know, I'm a full-time clinician and I'm trying to do this in my spare time. And the more income I get from my online stuff, the more it frees up to do this kind of work and eventually to get a book written so that you guys can just sit down by a fireplace and read this stuff and digest everything that's in my head without having to talk to me. Even though this is a wonderful way to do it, it's hard to reach 1 million or 2 million people this way. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you all. And I hope you all the best, and thank you for being such a wonderful audience. And maybe I'll see you on the STOA another time.
Thank you so much, Doug, for coming today. You know, it was a treat. I think everyone felt it was a treat here. And yeah, do support Doug, and hopefully he can have more time to come on the STOA and then help us work through our shit here. So just upcoming announcements of a couple of events. Raven.
I gotta run.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Doug. Take care. Raven, would you like to talk about Socratic speed dating that's coming up later today?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so at 7 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be doing another round of Socratic speed dating. So it'll be an opportunity to meet all these beautiful faces that you see in these Zoom rooms, have conversation and ask questions, and bond with people in the STOA community. So I would love to see all of you there. So yeah, and that's at 7 p.m. Eastern time, so just a little bit now. Yeah.
Right. And the Socratic speed dating is sort of like the heart of the STOA. It's where all the cool kids come and ask each other all the juicy and edgy questions. Travis Mann, he has a new event that's coming to the Wisdom Gym. Travis, would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So my event is called Breaking the Frame. And it's a process, a relational process, where we walk through examining our worldviews and finding ways that we can navigate through different worldviews and maybe identify and uncover some of the worldviews that we feel stuck in, and help each other out to process through those and enhance our cognitive flexibility.
Beautiful. Thank you, Travis. And it hasn't been on the website yet, but on June 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern time, all the post rats will love this. We got James Carse from Finite and Infinite Games booked. So if you don't know who he is, he's just kind of like everyone loves him. So yeah, that'd be awesome. It's going to be called Playing the Infinite Game during the Meta Crisis. So that should be a really fun jam. Hopefully it works out. If I know there's a lot of intense emotions we expressed experience today, you can go to the gainb.coffeehouse, and because I'm closing this one down. So if you want to go jam with each other, kind of process together, you can go there. Yeah. So that being said, thanks so much, everyone.